India announced its green hydrogen policy earlier this year, and the focus on finding alternative fuel to power India's growing needs has increased in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that we're seeing right now. Of course, India right now imports a large amount, a lion's share of the fuel that we require, crude that we require for a growing economy. Demand has gone up, prices are through the roof, and that's clearly a problem for us. In this context, a push on renewables has been made greater and greater over the last few years. Today on the show, I'm speaking to a very special guest. He's Sanjiv Lamba, the CEO of Linde PLC, which is one of the largest producers of gas in the world. Mr. Lamba, thank you so much for joining us on ET Now. Let me begin with the backdrop that I detailed in the introduction. Right now, more than ever before, the focus is on how India can create alternate sources of energy, because we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We need this crude to fuel our growing economy. The prices are through the roof, and there really aren't too many options. You know, your sense of what India can do to create alternatives.
Tamanna, it's great to be with you today. So I think this is a crucial question, one that many countries around the world are grappling with. Clearly, India as well. And there are two parts to the question that I think I want to just address. The first is clearly, the energy crisis that we're seeing, developments in Europe obviously triggering some of that. But even before that, we had seen the energy inflation, if you will, come through. And really, simplistically, I would say to you, this is really a result of underinvestment over an extended period of time in fossil fuels to some extent, and the lack of development of alternative fuels for some time as well. So I think the combination of that is where we find ourselves today. There is another piece to this, which I just want to add on, which is that the search for alternative fuels, while driven by the energy crisis today or accelerated by the energy crisis today, is really fundamentally also critical just from a climate change point of view. And in many parts of the world, that's what was driving for some time now the kind of development around alternative fuels. For India specifically, recognizing where we stand in terms of our natural resources, and to some extent the lack of oil and natural gas resources at scale, alternative energy and cleaner fuels, if you will, makes a lot of sense. And it needs to be a focused point of development from a policy point of view as well.
So, Mr. Lamba, earlier this year, India announced a new mission, a hydrogen mission, a policy change to really push, green energy and hydrogen really as a mainstream form of energy use. Your thoughts on that policy and whether it incentivizes players enough? In that light, what are the kind of investments that you're looking at?
So I think, let me take a step back, Tamanna, and just briefly kind of talk about things that ultimately drive or accelerate this development, right? So if you think of it conceptually, you need a policy statement that has some teeth, that actually does either incentivize or penalize the current energy portfolio or the development of new energy portfolio. The second piece that you need is you need a cost-effective alternative fuels strategy that ensures that there's an inflection point at which wide-scale adoption happens. And the third element is that industries, and in the case of mobility as well, elsewhere in the world, you find that there are applications on the industrial side and the infrastructure necessary on the mobility side available. These are the three factors that typically drive the pace at which you see development happen. In the case of India, I would say to you that I think rightly so, the stress really has been around ensuring that industrial applications pick this up. And green hydrogen consumption obligations that are being put into place, I think are the right way to incentivize or encourage people to move in that direction. But to be fair, the point of inflection that I talked about earlier, where wide-scale adoption is going to happen, is some way away. There isn't, particularly on the green side, technology available at scale today, or will be available, I would say, in the next 5 to 7 years at scale to be able to provide the push that we believe it really needs to move in that direction. And that is really the dilemma that people will be faced with. My view is that blue hydrogen as an interim, as a bridge, if you will, to getting to the point of seeing widespread adoption and conversion to green, I think is the way to go in a number of geographies, particularly if they are natural gas rich. In the case of India, for instance, where you don't have that level of scaled resources on natural gas, then that bridge is really importing, say, blue ammonia as an example, into the country as one part of the portfolio in that transition that happens.
You talked about a policy that needs to have teeth. Do you think this policy has teeth?
I'd say to you that this policy needs more work to actually have teeth for it to really see widespread adoption. So I am looking forward to seeing that green hydrogen consumption obligation, become real and something that then can actually be part of an enforceable policy statement, which encourages behaviors in that particular direction. I think there's some way to go. The fact that we have a framework, the fact that we have policy intent is important, but as you know, in most cases, policy intent is never enough. You really need the enforcement piece around policy to come into place for an effective transition to begin and then ultimately get scale.
So in that context, on this very show, I've spoken to one of the largest steel players, and their point is we need incentives, we need financial incentives from the government to go green, and especially when it comes to hydrogen. Do you think that enough of those incentives are in place?
And Tamanna, I would agree with that statement. So if I give you a global overview a little bit when we talk about incentives or penalties, right? So in Europe, for instance, you have the ETS system, which actually places a cost on carbon. That's one way to go. In many other parts of the world, we see very clear investment-linked incentives. So the US, for instance, offers a 45Q. That's a tax incentive for making a substantial investment, which allows decarbonization to happen. Or in South Korea or elsewhere, we have incentives which are investment-linked. So upfront, they provide for the momentum, to build the momentum. They provide the incentive that allows infrastructure build-up to happen. There are, of course, production-linked incentives as well, which I think are certainly from a medium term, I'd say 5 to 10 years, the right way to go. So not only do you get an incentive to set the facility up, but you get an incentive to continue to produce till such time you see technology inflection that allows for a cost-effective alternative fuel to be developed. I think India is contemplating PLI or production-linked incentives. I think that does make sense. I see Germany, which is the other country which has a contract for differences. Similarly, it's kind of production-linked and basically says, we will subsidize the difference between standard hydrogen, as an example, versus a blue or a green hydrogen, and that difference will come under the contract for differences, which allows for people to make that investment, create a business model, and create a production infrastructure, ultimately leading to widespread adoption and scale.
Let me talk about hydrogen in the context of transport and this debate on whether hydrogen is the best bet. In India, we're seeing this big push towards electric vehicles. And the thing with hydrogen is it's probably cleaner, but it's more expensive and difficult to push through. Your thoughts on this?
Yes, Tamanna, and I'd say you very, very simplistically, I say to you, the way you should think about it is where you have large payloads, that's where hydrogen makes the difference. So I'd say for trucks, for buses, ultimately for trains, ferries, where you have large payloads, hydrogen is the preferred fuel. You just cannot get enough battery on board to be able to carry payloads like that effectively. But you have passenger cars, which is where I think some of the fascination tends to be around hydrogen. The reality is that's really not the fuel. I would say an EV vehicle using electricity is probably a better alternative, from a clean energy point of view than really a hydrogen passenger car. Of course, we do have hydrogen passenger cars. We welcome them. We are happy to refuel them. But the reality is economics on EVs are better.
Having said that, I just want to know a little more about your plans in India. How excited are you about this market, and what is the kind of strategy and investment you're putting in place?
So Tamanna, what I'm going to do is give you just a global context, and then within that, I think dive deeper a little bit on the India piece. So, I often talk to my investors and say to them, look, I'm working at the moment as we speak on about 300 projects. We talk about probability weighted investment of about 5 billion in the next 3 years that we'll be making decisions on. If I look at the full landscape of investments, we're talking anywhere between 20 to 25 billion. So Linde has high commitment to be investing in this space. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into the India kind of scenario. As I see it, we have policy intent. I talked about this earlier. It does need to go a bit further to make sure that it gets to a point where you're seeing that fully enforced. We see that India will be an attractive market, both from an industrial point of view and also longer term, I would say, and I say this probably next decade from a mobility point of view, because the infrastructure necessary for mobility and the OEM capability to have vehicles that are ready for hydrogen on mobility, certainly the high payload factor vehicles that I talked about, all of that I think is still under development, will be scaled up probably a decade from now. So really the focus, I think, from an Indian investment perspective for us is about industrial applications where we can provide green hydrogen. And I think I recognize here that renewable power in India provides a great enabler for green hydrogen to happen. However, I said earlier on as well, the technology roadmap for green hydrogen, irrespective of what technologies you choose, whether it's PEM, alkaline, whether it's some of the other developing technologies, none of those are at scale today to really make a difference. So the way I'd summarize that, it's probably the end of this decade, the back end of this decade, the second half of this decade, where you'll see somewhat higher scale in terms of green hydrogen production, which is starting to become cost effective. That scale will allow technology development to further move in the direction to provide for higher degree of adoption, and longer term, you'll see that transition then get successfully done.
To round up, a lot of Indians at mass level may not be very familiar with Linde, but it became mainstream during the second wave of COVID-19 when there was an acute shortage of oxygen. Private companies were called upon to help. Can you take us through that time?
I have to tell you that was probably one of the most challenging periods that we as a corporation faced, but also I think the world faced. And really the way I want to describe it, and I want to really start off by telling you how humbling it was as an experience for leaders like us to see the commitment that our frontline staff brought to bringing life-saving medical oxygen to hospitals, and in the case of US, we also took that to homes in terms of home care that we provided to patients as well. So I think from my perspective, I'd say to you that that commitment translated into a whole program that galvanized across the world. Now, India really, in many cases, in many ways, was a case study, if you will, in terms of how we were able to take a series of actions supported by the government to ensure that medical oxygen availability, was at its maximum levels. Now, remember, we were supplying a third of India's medical oxygen requirements at that point in time. They had, moved up to about 10,000 tons per day of medical oxygen requirements at that stage. What tended to happen was not only were our teams in India working round the clock, ensuring that we were providing schedules for production, for moving, for ensuring that we were working with the army and the government to move product on railways. Hadn't happened before in ever. We were moving, using some army and navy vehicles to ensure that it got to the destinations it was acutely required in. But also we were able to galvanize the rest of the world to make sure that storage tanks, liquid oxygen filled tanks were then provided, whether it was from Southeast Asia, from Middle East, or indeed coming as far from as Germany and Europe, to ensure that they were all available in India. And one of the points I just want to mention to you is those tanks are still in India today. We are looking ahead to say, well, is there a third wave? Should we, how can we be better prepared, having learned the lessons from the second wave, to make sure that we don't have to go through that same pain and same, kind of unfortunate set of circumstances as we stand today. So as I said, humbling experience, the commitment of our staff in India and elsewhere in the world, making sure that that oxygen got to some of the remotest points in the country, ensuring lives were saved as a consequence of that was really, I think, for us, it was a difficult period, but an enormous learning.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Lamba, for speaking with us here today and joining us on the show.